Dark beer. Very nice. What's the difference between beer and wine?
Beer and wine is very different. Wine, okay, so
grain.
okay, so wine is actually made of three things only: water, grapes, and your yeast. Maybe you don't even have water, some of them just use straight up grape juice, right? But I know some of them, most of the time they add water to dilute it as well, right? To make a blend and all that, right? So that is wine. And what's the difference between beer and cider? Is cider a beer?
Cider is acidic.
Yes, correct. Cider is apple, fruit lah, whatever fruit, right?
Yeah.
It could be an apple, it could be a pear or whatever. It's just fruits, water, and yeast. So you don't have hops, you don't have malt. Meat, you all know what is meat? Fermented honey.
Meat, yeah, honey.
Right? Meat is actually closer to wine. It's just honey, water, and yeast. So a lot of times, so the reason why I want to use this chance to actually explain what this is what beer is because, you know, every time you go to supermarket or you go to the airport or whatever, you see, when you used to go to the airport, right, you see everything, all these are always on the same shelf. Cider, beers, and meat, they always put it on the same shelf, but actually they're actually very different. They're not even close. Probably the only common thing they have together is just the yeast and the fermentation. Right, and even then the yeast use is quite different. So I'll go into that later. Right. So like I said, you take out any one of these ingredients, you're no longer called a beer. But when you have all these four ingredients, you can add anything else, you're still called a beer. Right? So you can add coffee, you can add like what we did, you can add flowers, you can add fruit, blah blah and everything, you're still called a beer. Right? So just now you said alcohol, right? I've been reading quite a bit and I've not read anywhere that specifically defines that you must have alcohol to be considered a beer.
But then ginger beer. I mean, can have little alcohol.
Yes.
But then in the fermentation process, they should produce some alcohol, right?
Yes. But then again, if I take out now with technology, right?
It's not a beer.
If I take out the alcohol, now you have the Heineken 00 and all this alcohol-free beer, right?
So sad.
It's still called a beer because you must understand, alcohol in the end is just a side effect. It's just a product of fermentation.
Yeah, byproduct.
It's just a byproduct. So even you realize out of this one, even if, for example, if I take out carbon dioxide, if I take out your carbonation, I take out your alcohol, is it still a beer? It is a beer, but it may not be a very nice beer, but it's still a beer. Right? Here we go. Right? So the very first thing I'm going to talk about is not here, obviously, it's water. Okay, so water definitely plays a very huge role in making beer. For probably some of you science nerds here, you all probably know about water chemistry. So when I talk about water chemistry, basically we're talking about different mineral salt levels inside the water as well. So of course, different locations around the world, they have different mineral salt levels in the water, and how this actually affects the beer, it actually affects the flavors of the beer. Right? So technically there are actually two kinds of water. There's hard water and soft water. Hard water, what determines the hardness of the water is how much minerals you have in the water. So the general rule of thumb is this, right? The more minerals you have in the water, the harder the water is. Okay? And the general rule of thumb also is that the harder the water, the better it is for more robust beers. Whereas the softer the water is better for more cleaner tasting beers. So I'm sure all of you know this particular beer called Guinness, right?
Yeah.
The stout. So one theory why Guinness is so popular and it goes so well, and also partially why it tastes so different when you go to Ireland and drink it versus when you drink it in other parts of the world, is really because of the water source. So apparently the water source at St. James in Ireland, apparently the water there, the mineral content there is quite high, right? It's high in sulfates and high in your carbonate as well. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, Pilsner, right? It originates from a town called Pilsen in Czech Republic, right? The water there is very soft. That's why it's also very, very good for very clean beers like your Pilsners, your lagers, right? So some of you may be thinking that Singapore's water is what? Singapore's water typically is soft. So essentially what happened is, I think if I'm not wrong, how our water is done is basically it's stripped off of everything. All the minerals basically zero, then they add back inside. That's how our water is lah. But this is the two main real products lah, right? But along this process, what the yeast also does is it creates flavor. So this is probably something that a lot of people don't realize. They thought that, oh, all this flavor is created by all these things, you know, you've got all your grains and everything inside. Yes and no. Yes and no. What all these grains does is actually provides the backbone. Right? It provides the backbone, it creates the main flavor. But when the yeast comes in, right, depends on the kind of yeast that you use. You probably get more floral flavors, certain fruity flavors, and sometimes it's a little bit sour or whatever. It really depends on the yeast. Right? So for example, Belgian yeast. So you know the Belgians, they like their wines a lot, right? So there's this kind of beer, they call the Belgian beers, right? The trapeze beers or even the lambics or basically beers that are very similar to wine. And the reason is very simple because when they were making the beer, they decided to use the same yeast they use for their wine. And yes, it still does the job, but what it does to the beer is it gives it a very floral, very fruity, almost like sour kind of profile. And that's what makes Belgian beer so special. Definitely, to a certain extent, it does. It does. The higher, which is why your vodka or your rum and whatever it is, it doesn't spoil, because of the high alcohol content in there. It's impossible for any germs to go in there. Because generally, yeast, right? Yeast doesn't take very high alcohol content unless you use very specialized yeast.
Untolerance.
Yes, correct. So, for example, there's some argument of bread yeast. You cannot use bread yeast to make beer, right? Reason being, bread yeast cannot take very high alcohol content, right? But high is a matter of perspective, lah. Anything below 5%, I guess, I think a bread yeast can easily get you there. So probably you can make a beer about 3% using bread yeast. Whether nice or not, that's a different issue, lah, right? Over here is all the grains. So as you can see, obviously Singapore, we don't have a barley field, right? So our grains are usually from UK, from Germany, from all these other countries. It rapidly cools. It just cools the beer from boiling temperature from 100 immediately to 20 degrees. The reason why we need to chill it so much, because we want to add the yeast. If the yeast is a live thing, you put it at too high temperature, the yeast will die. So I put it through here, then from here, it comes out about 20 degrees, then you go to one of these tanks, any one of these tanks. These tanks, then after it goes to one of these tanks, then we add the yeast. After we add the yeast, 14 days later, then there is all. One thing you notice is each of them all have this thing here. What this thing breeds is actually the pressure, right? So when yeast consumes the sugar, it produces two things. It produces carbon dioxide and produces alcohol, right? This pressure is caused by the carbon dioxide itself. Yeah, this is one that's stuck, so you can go and smell. Anybody else want one? Yeah, please go. Chocolatey coffee notes. Slight. Because this one is brewed with something special inside.
That beer. Very nice.
It's brewed with mushroom cordyceps.
So
Your malts
this
are
is the
natural.
bottle,
Okay, so the malts.
and
So,
I could only see a
for this,
monster-
we typically add a little bit
monster
more.
picture here.
We want the creaminess.
So the alcohol content is
So because of that, add a little bit
5.5%.
more. We don't add lactose. It has no lactose. But what with the creaminess you get is from the
Very
wheat
nice.
and from the oat.